You are looking at a photograph taken at Ashford Academy in the autumn of 1900. At first glance, it appears ordinary enough, just a typical Victorian school portrait. 8 students in crisp uniforms standing stiffly on the chapel steps, 2 solemn teachers at their sides. A snapshot of innocence, of discipline, of order. But look closer and you'll see something isn't quite right, because within months of that day, a series of strange, tragic events began to shake the school. One by one, the children in the photograph started meeting untimely ends. Accidents so precise, so impossible, they could never have been coincidence. Even the teachers were not spared. One was struck down by a sudden heart attack, and the other vanished without a trace. This is the story behind the cursed photograph of Ashford Academy. To uncover the truth, we must step back to that cold October morning and relive what happened. The courtyard of Ashford Academy breathed with a brittle October chill. Frost clung to the iron gates, and the old chapel's bell tolled with a hollow sound that seemed to echo longer than it should, as though the stone walls were holding on to it. 10 figures gathered on the chapel steps that morning. 8 students in stiff wool uniforms and 2 teachers standing like sentinels. At the center, among the children, stood 15-year-old Adrian Locke, his silver blazer pin gleaming faintly in the pale light. Adrian was not the tallest, nor the boldest, but he had a mind that refused to rest. While the others shuffled nervously, his gaze lingered on the chapel door behind them. Carved into its dark oak were strange, twisting vines that seemed to form patterns if one stared too long. Adrian often did. Today, however, he forced his eyes away, straightening his shoulders as the photographer assembled his cumbersome brass camera. "Hold still," ordered Mr. Wentworth, the stern master with a baritone voice. Beside him, Mrs. Harcourt, gentler yet no less commanding, offered a tight smile to the students. The camera's great eye glinted. The man behind it struck a magnesium flare. A violent burst of white fire filled the air, searing every eyelid. For a breathless moment, Adrian thought the sun itself had exploded. When his vision cleared, the photographer was already lowering his head beneath the black cloth, satisfied. The shutter had opened, the deed was done. But Adrian had seen something wrong. In that instant of blinding light, a shadow had appeared on the chapel door. It wasn't cast by any of them, too tall, too crooked, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The others blinked, rubbed their eyes, but Adrian froze. His heart struck like a hammer against his ribs, and when he looked again, the shadow was gone. Only the door remained. The group dispersed soon after, their chatter and laughter slowly filling the courtyard again. But Adrian, he couldn't shake it. That image burned behind his eyes, dark, crooked, alive. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of the shadow again, only this time, it wasn't behind him. It was among them, standing in line, smiling faintly as though it had been there all along. Days later, the class portrait was framed and hung in the headmaster's study. Visitors admired it, 8 youthful faces, caught in stillness, the chapel's stone arch rising solemnly behind them. And there they stood, 2 teachers, guardians carved from silence. To everyone else, it was a keepsake, a celebration of discipline and tradition. To Adrian, it was a trap. He began studying the photograph in stolen moments. The glass caught the light oddly, sometimes bending his reflection into the frame so that he seemed to be standing there beside his classmates. More troubling was the boy on the far right. His face was strange, smiling wider than the others, his eyes sharper. Yet Adrian could not recall him at all. "Who is he?" Adrian whispered one evening in the dormitory, clutching the photograph to his chest. His roommate, William Holton, frowned. "That's Edward, no Edmund, or blasted, I don't remember his name. He left, didn't he?" First week of term, Adrian wanted to believe him, but the truth itched in his skull. He had never seen that boy outside the photograph, not once in the dining hall, not in the classrooms, not on the playing fields. And yet, there he was, as clear as Adrian himself, smiling with unsettling certainty. One evening, while the others dined, Adrian slipped into the study. The fire had burned low, painting the walls with restless shadows. He moved closer to the portrait, candlelight trembling across the faces. For a heartbeat, the photograph seemed to breathe. The unfamiliar boy's eyes glinted, as though wet. Adrian staggered back, nearly dropping the candle. The clock ticked with unnatural slowness, each second stretching too long. From the corner of the study came a whisper, just a breath of sound, so soft he might have imagined it. "Stay still." Adrian spun, but no one was there. Only shelves of dust and old ledgers, the weight of centuries pressing down. That night, lying rigid in bed, Adrian heard the whisper again, closer this time, inside his own pillow. He clutched the silver medal on his chest until sleep finally dragged him under. By winter, unease spread silently among the students. Strange accidents had begun to dot the days, a lantern exploding. In the workshop, a horse breaking. Free from the stable with wild eyes, a sudden fever in the younger dormitory, nothing fatal yet. But each time, Adrian noticed the same thing. When he checked the portrait afterward, something had changed. A faint smudge on one student's cheek, a new shadow along Mr. Wentworth's sleeve. And the boy on the right, his grin seemed to widen. Adrian tried to tell Emily Collins, the girl who sat 2 rows ahead in chapel. She listened kindly, but laughed it off. "It's just your nerves. You read too much." But that night, Adrian dreamed again of the chapel steps. All 10 figures stood there, except this time, he was the one missing from the line. When he jolted awake, gasping, the portrait lay on his bedside table. He was certain he had not brought it there. The glass gleamed faintly in the moonlight. And in the far right corner, the strange boy's face looked sharper than ever, as though he had moved closer. Adrian Locke began to wonder if the camera had captured more than their likeness. Perhaps in that blinding moment when the shutter opened, it had trapped something else inside the frame. Something watching, something waiting, and it was only just beginning. The first tragedy came quietly, almost too ordinary to raise alarm. On a dim March morning, William Holton, one of the students from Ashford Academy, failed to appear at roll call. By midday, his body was pulled from the river, his Latin book still tucked inside his coat pocket. The headmaster's report called it a misstep on wet ground. Yet Adrian Locke replayed the details in his mind again and again. William knew every curve of that riverbank. He had studied there 100 times. In chapel, the students bowed their heads. Silence hung heavy beneath the vaulted ceiling. Adrian did not pray. He stared instead at the portrait on the wall. William's face seemed duller than he remembered, as if the ink itself had thinned, fading from the paper like breath on glass. Perhaps it was only poor lamplight. Still, he felt the change. That night, Adrian studied the photograph by candlelight. The flame trembled, shadows crawling across the frame. He pressed his thumb against the boy on the far right, the one no one could name. The smile seemed sharper now. The trick of the eye, or something else? By midsummer, the academy reeled again. Fire swept through the girls' dormitory when a lantern fell onto an oilcloth. Clara Neville, smallest of the group, slipped back inside for her doll. She never returned. The official account described smoke inhalation, a tragic but ordinary fate. But when Adrian and Emily Collins examined the portrait that evening, Clara's image appeared strangely faded, her outline blurred. "Tell me you see it," Emily whispered. Adrian nodded, though he could not explain it. Photographs did not change. Yet the evidence sat before them, framed in guilt. Rumors spread. Mothers in chapel whispered of curses. Mr. Wentworth dismissed it sharply. Superstition has no place here. But his eyes betrayed unease. Whenever he crossed the study corridor, Mrs. Harcourt grew quiet, her gaze lingering too long. On the photograph during prayers, Adrian turned to the library for answers. Among dust-coated ledgers, he found a curious entry: restoration of chapel apse, inscription sealed. Another noted the purchase of photographic equipment from a London firm, unusual for a school of modest means. Why restore a hidden apse, and why invest so heavily in a camera? Driven by restless logic, Adrian began mapping events. He compared the timing of accidents to the order in which students stood in the portrait. William had been second from the left, Clara seated at the front, both gone. He drew lines on scrap paper tracing the pattern. The more he looked, the more inevitable it seemed. The photograph was not a keepsake, but a sequence. One night during a thunderstorm, he explored the chapel alone. The rain beat against the stained glass, lightning exposing carved designs. In the oak panels, circles, intersecting lines, symbols he recognized, faintly from his readings, patterns of symmetry, geometry, repetition. They reminded him not of religion, but of experiment. Beneath the choir stalls, he noticed a narrow iron door. It led to a cramped chamber, blackened by soot. On the wall, faint chalk markings. concentric circles, intersected by vertical strokes, almost like a crude diagram of optics. At the center was a shape resembling a lens. Adrian crouched, beside fragments on the floor, burned paper, glass shards from a shattered frame. Another photograph had once existed here, destroyed deliberately. He touched the edge of the ash, his mind racing. Why destroy one portrait and commission another? Back in his dormitory, Adrian's thoughts turned feverish. The accidents, the entries in the ledger. The erased photograph. It pointed not to spirits, but to design. Someone had used the act of photography itself as an experiment. The flash, the exposure, the geometry carved into the chapel, pieces of a pattern he had yet to solve. And if his mapping was correct, the next student in line was already living on borrowed time. By the spring term, Adrian Locke could no longer deny it. The photograph was changing. After William's drowning and Clara's death in the fire, their faces in the portrait had dulled, blurred at the edges, like ink bleeding into water. Adrian showed it to Emily Collins under lamplight. She traced the fading outlines, with her finger pale with fear. "Photographs don't decay like this," she said. "Not so quickly." "They do," Adrian argued, though his voice faltered. "This isn't decay. It's selective." Selective, that word haunted him. The rest of the photograph remained sharp, the stone arch, the carved oak door, even the texture of the wall lasers. Only the children's faces shifted, as if a hand erased them one by one. When James Harper fell from the chapel tower in April, crushed on the cobblestones below, the pattern became undeniable. James's figure in the photograph had dulled within days. Adrian marked the change. In his notebook, sketching comparisons between the portrait and his memory of the boy's smile, he began compiling rows of observations: who had died, where they stood, how their likeness faded. The sequence aligned too neatly to dismiss. It was as if the accidents were following a preordained order, the order of their arrangement in the portrait. But why? Adrian's search for answers took him deeper into the Academy's archives. Dusty registers revealed the name of the photographer, Hector Lavington, a chemist turned photographer known in London circles for experimenting with light-sensitive compounds. Adrian copied the name into his notebook. Lavington had written papers on optics, but also on impression capture, the theory that images retained more than appearances. That exposure might preserve fragments of energy itself. To most readers, such claims were eccentric. To Adrian, they now felt like a key. If Lavington's camera was built on more than ordinary glass and brass, if it was designed with the chapel's geometry in mind, then the photograph might be more than paper. It could be an experiment in permanence, recording not just lightness, but something essential, something measurable. But if something was taken, what filled the absence it left behind? The more erratic he became. At meals, he muttered equations under his breath. He filled pages with diagrams, light rays, shutter timings, concentric circles, echoing those chalk markings he had seen under the chapel. He borrowed physics texts from the library, cross-referencing exposure times with the sequence of accidents. Emily grew worried. "You're seeing connections that aren't there," she said one evening. "Accidents happen, fires happen, falls happen." Adrian shook his head. "Not in sequence, not in alignment with the photograph." "Look," he showed her the notebook, the names of the students mapped against their positions. "If this continues, the next is Arthur Selby. He stood near the right edge. He'll be next." Emily closed the book. "And what then? Do you plan to stop it?" Adrian didn't answer. His eyes had already returned to the photograph, scanning for changes invisible to anyone else. Weeks later, Arthur Selby drowned in the river during a morning fishing trip. His oar slipped, the boat tipped, and by the time rescuers arrived, the current had claimed him. That night, Adrian confirmed it. Arthur's image had dulled. The pattern was precise. The photograph did not lie. But what unsettled Adrian most was not Arthur's fading face. It was the boy on the far right, the boy with no name. His image had not faded at all. On the contrary, his face seemed sharper, brighter, as if gaining definition with every death. Adrian wrote in his notebook, "The others diminish, he strengthens." By midsummer, Adrian's sleep collapsed into fragments. He dreamed of exposure plates, of blinding white light, of rows of faces erased in sequence. By day, he studied optics until his vision blurred. He measured the angles of sunlight against the chapel windows, tested how light refracted through his silver medal, and wondered if the emblem itself had been chosen for a reason. Was the portrait draining life or transferring it? One evening, Adrian returned to the soot-stained chamber below the chapel. This time, he brought Emily. Together, they examined the markings more carefully. Adrian held his candle near the wall, tracing the intersecting circles. "It isn't ritual," he said. "It's geometry, an optical diagram." Emily frowned. "For what purpose?" Adrian swallowed. "To align light, lens, and subject perfectly, to capture more than the eye can see." He gestured to the pile of ash, the remnants of the destroyed photograph, and when the results were too disturbing, they burned it. But someone ordered it done again. Emily shivered, her candlelight flickering against the wall. Then whoever commissioned it knew exactly what they were doing. Adrian lowered his eyes, or worse, he thought, they still do. Back in his room, he stared at the portrait for hours. 6 faces remained clear, 3 had blurred. The unnamed boy gleamed brighter than ever. His smile cut sharp against the sepia tones. Adrian's mind reeled with equations, questions, and dread. If the pattern held, half the children were already lost. The rest would follow. And Adrian Locke was running out of time to decide whether he was a subject in the experiment or its final outcome. By the time autumn returned to Ashford, Adrian Locke's obsession had narrowed to a single figure, the boy on the far right of the portrait. No records listed his name, no ledger, no class roll, no dormitory assignment. Adrian searched registers dating back years. Nothing. It was as though the boy had materialized, for the photograph alone. And yet his image grew sharper with every death, as if he were the true subject of the experiment. Adrian began calling him the Constant. In a notebook thick with equations and diagrams, he wrote, "Others diminish. Constant strengthens. Variables exhausted. Control remains." Emily watched his fixation grow with unease. "You're treating him like a formula," she said one evening. "He is a formula," Adrian replied. "He's the proof that this isn't accident or superstition. This is deliberate design." The more Adrian studied, the more the experiment revealed itself. The children stood in sequence, in the photograph. Each accident followed that order. But the boy without a name? He wasn't in the original seating plan at all. Adrian checked. On the day of the portrait, 8 students had been scheduled, not 9. Someone had been added. The realization struck like ice. The experiment had introduced a control variable, a figure outside the system, immune to its erasure. If the unnamed boy's clarity increased as the others faded, then what he represented wasn't just immunity, it was absorption. Adrian tested the idea with brutal logic. He measured the density of the portrait under magnifying glass, comparing areas of shadow and light. Where William's face had blurred, the pigment thinned. Where the boy without a name appeared, the density deepened. The ink itself seemed redistributed. "It's transfer," Adrian muttered, "like current moving through a circuit." Emily recoiled. "Are you saying their lives are being siphoned into him?" Adrian shook his head. "Not libs impressions, patterns of being. Whatever Lavington designed, it's recording more than appearances. It's extracting identity." As the term wore on, Adrian noticed smaller vanishings. Around the academy, faint pencil notations erased. From old books, chalk diagrams smudged. Beyond recognition, even names missing from class rosters. It was as if the mechanism of the portrait reached beyond itself, rewriting memory in subtle strokes. Students who had once spoken fondly of Clara or Arthur now paused, uncertain, their recollections blurred. "She was quiet, wasn't she?" they said, fumbling. "Or perhaps I'm misremembering." Adrian felt rage boil. Not misremembering, erased. He carried the photograph everywhere now, hidden beneath his coat. At night, he held it against lamplight, watching for the moment another face dulled. The boy without a name never blurred. His eyes grew clearer, his expression more deliberate. One evening, Adrian returned to the hidden chamber beneath the chapel. He brought Emily again, though she came reluctantly. Together they examined the diagrams more carefully. This time, Adrian noticed faint words, scratched into the stone near the circles. Latin, half erased, memoria fixa, corpus translatum. Fixed memory, transferred body, Adrian translated. Emily's hand trembled. Transferred where? Adrian stared at the concentric diagrams, then at the photograph in his hands. Into him, into the Constant. The following week, tragedy struck again. A carriage overturned on the gravel drive, crushing two boys from the photograph. By evening, their faces had dulled on the portrait. And the boy without a name? His features shone with uncanny precision, every strand of hair distinct, every shadow sharpened. Adrian slammed the frame onto his desk. He's not absorbing them. He's becoming them. Emily looked stricken. Then what happens? When the last face fades, Adrian's hand froze on the glass. His own face, still sharp in the photograph, stared back at him. That night he wrote furiously in his notebook, "Experiment incomplete." When final subject erased, Constant achieves total integration. What is the purpose? Immortality, substitution. But beneath his equations another line scrawled itself, almost without thought, or am I the final subject? Adrian Locke closed the notebook and pressed his silver medal hard against his palm. The order was nearly complete. The faces were vanishing, and the boy without a name was waiting. By winter, only 3 faces remained clear. In the portrait, Emily Collins, Adrian Locke, and the boy without a name. The others had dulled into smudges, their identities absorbed. Into the sharper lines of the Constant. His features were no longer vague, he looked, as though he could step directly out of the frame, jaw defined, hair distinct, his eyes startlingly alive. Adrian barely slept. His notebooks overflowed. With diagrams and calculations, he timed exposure intervals of Lavington's camera, studied the chemical processes of collodion plates, and sketched out equations linking light, pigment, and energy transfer. Each page ended with the same conclusion: the experiment was converging on him. One night, Emily confronted him in the study. "You can't keep staring at it. You'll drive yourself mad." Adrian's reply was flat. "If I stop, I'll miss the moment." The moment of what? The last exposure, when the Constant completes integration. Emily gripped his wrist. "Then destroy it. Burn it like the first photograph. End it." Adrian hesitated. He had considered it 100 times, but doubt gnawed. If the photograph was truly absorbing essence, memories, identities, then destroying it might not free them. It might erase them utterly. "I can't risk it," he whispered. "If the experiment is designed to preserve, destruction could mean obliteration, no trace. No recovery." The question shifted from whether the experiment could be stopped to whether Adrian himself was meant to finish it. In his notebook he wrote, "Final subject must choose, integration or erasure, either completes design." The thought hollowed him. Had Lavington built the experiment, not merely to capture identity, but to force a decision, to test whether one would surrender to permanence or obliterate the record? In early spring, Emily fell ill, a fever with no clear cause. Sudden, relentless. Doctors tried tonics and rest, but her strength withered. Adrian sat by her bed each night, the portrait on his lap. Emily's image blurred slowly, as though the photograph was already writing her out. On the evening, she slipped into unconsciousness. Adrian pressed the silver medal into her palm. "Stay with me," he begged. "You must resist it." But by morning, she was gone. When Adrian staggered into his room, he lifted the portrait. Emily's face had already dulled to shadow. Only 2 figures remained sharp, Adrian himself and the Constant. That night, Adrian returned to the chamber, beneath the chapel for the last time. He set the portrait against the wall, beneath the etched diagrams. Lightning flickered through the cracks above, illuminating the circles and Latin words. He studied the image long and hard. The Constant's eyes seemed to meet his own, direct, unblinking. "This is what you were designed for," Adrian muttered. "Not immortality, not curse, but substitution, a machine of exchange." He realized then what the last exposure meant. The camera had not captured them all equally. It had set a stage where one subject would remain whole, while the others became impressions, absorbed, redistributed, erased. The Constant was proof, but the choice was his. If Adrian allowed the cycle to complete, his face would fade, and the Constant would stand alone, fully integrated. If he destroyed the portrait, the record of all of them, William, Clara, James, Emily, would vanish with it, no recovery possible. To preserve or obliterate, memory or nothing. Adrian lifted the frame. The glass felt warm, almost pulsing beneath his fingers. For a moment, he saw his reflection, overlapping the Constant's face until they nearly merged. He thought of William's laugh, Clara's doll, Emily's steady courage. Could he condemn them to vanish as if they had never lived? Could he surrender himself instead, ensuring the Constant carried them forward in some form, however twisted? The chapel bell tolled midnight above him. The sound shook the chamber, dust falling like ash. Adrian raised the portrait higher. His final words, scratched into his notebook later, would be brief. Last subject chooses integration. What happened next was never recorded. The portrait vanished from Ashford's halls. Some whispered Adrian burned it, ending the cycle. Others insisted it survived, hidden in some attic where the boy without a name still smiles with uncanny sharpness. The truth remains unknowable. But those who studied Ashford's ledgers found one final oddity. In the Register of Students for 1900, a name appears at the far right of the list. Ink darker, fresher than the rest. Adrian Locke, not as a survivor, as if he had been there all along, fixed in place, a constant among the vanished.